Our last talk of this morning's session will be given by Mark Lawson from Heriot-Watt University, who's asking, what are topological code groups?
Thank you very much. So, as usual, I'd like to thank all the organisers, but in particular, Yin, Ben, for having to deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in various guises, and remaining serene despite all the trouble that I was going to say British bureaucracy and universities could throw at her, but I won't say that. So I am going to answer this question. I was a bit worried because this isn't really my own work. I've been sort of sucking some algebraic juice out of this work. What I wanted to talk about this because I think it's actually quite important, and I can say it's important because it's not my work. It's been a great pleasure talking to various people, meeting people, being in an environment where the word semigroup and the word groupoid does not cause people to run screaming from the room. It's also been a pleasure hearing about categories. I was a bit nervous. I'm going to mention categories, but you seem to sort of take 2 categories and 3 categories in your stride. What I'm going to do is much, much easier. So I don't feel bad about that. So I don't think I need to apologize in advance. What I'm going to do is read one example and some theorems and a question. Now, remember, I'm staying between you and lunch. So you better be good. I was going to give a proper talk with slides. I'm going to write. Now, I should warn you, my students think I have terrible handwriting. This is wrong. I think I have the best demotic hieroglyphs of anybody. So if you can't read something, or it's too small or too big, or you just can't read it, do shout out and I'll try and do a bit better. I can't promise I'll do better, but I'll try and do better. So what I'm going to do eventually is look at an example, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions in the form of a couple of theorems, and I'm going to ask a question. There are lots of questions that I can ask. I'm just going to ask one particular one. But before I get to the interesting stuff, there's a whole bunch of stuff I have to get through. In particular, I have to tell you what I mean by topological foregroup and so on. Now, since Lisa very kindly mentioned semigroups, which weren't necessarily inverse, I remember Johannes Kellenhoff came up to me one day and saying to me, Mark, he said, do you know there are semigroups that aren't inverse? I couldn't believe it. Extraordinary stuff. So I think the way to think about semigroups in the context of C-string algebras is that they are, let's say, abstract systems of partial functions. So you might imagine, for example, they will crop up in things like theoretical computer science. In your field, you're particularly keen on functions that have extra properties, limiting properties. So there's some kind of connection. So this is the way I think about it. You might start there and then do something else. From your point of view, something more interesting. I'm particularly interested in a tail groupoids. I believe état is a French word meaning nice. And in my book, these are the nice. I believe there's some other groupoids. Lisa has alluded to them. Maybe Anna as well. I believe there are other ones, but those are the only ones I believe in. And from your point of view, I think they're important because you don't have to worry about measure theory. It comes automatically. So why do we care? Well, I come from an algebra background. So if you've got an état groupoid, what Pedro Resend showed was that if you take the open subsets of an état groupoid, you get a monoid. Always. That's almost a characterization of état groupoid. So it's a bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I forget who's the nice one, who's the nasty one. But one of them is a groupoid. Let's say that's Mr. Hyde. And this is your monoid. I assume that's the nice guy. So, and this was proved by Resende. And of course, this has extra properties. He tends to look at things from the point of view of what he calls quantales, which are lattice ordered monoids. And so he doesn't work with inverse semigroups or semigroups of the type that you look at. But down here, so apparently way down here, you have what you like to call ample groupoids. Now, ample groupoids are a particular type of a tau groupoid. I call them Boolean groupoids, just to be precise. And I call them Boolean groupoids because they are a tau groupoids whose space of identities is a Boolean space. So that's why I call them Boolean groupoids. And they're the things that partake of a generalization of classical stone duality, where you replace the Boolean algebra by Boolean inverse monoid, and you replace the Boolean space by Boolean groupoid or ample groupoid. And that's where these ultrafilters come in, if you use the filters. And one of the reasons we have this separate terminology is we want to look at things in between, which have identity spaces that lie in between. So up here, for example, these are connected with pseudogroups, which you might know as pseudogroups of transformations, but we also look at the abstract side as well. And then down here, you have the Boolean inverse models. Okay, now, I'm going to be talking about topological full groups. So under this correspondence, you don't have to sort of know this, but I'm just going to tell you so you're aware of it. So you've got these Boolean inverse monoids, and they're monoids, so they have a group of units, like the vertical elements. Okay, so for me, a topological full group is the group of units of this Boolean inverse monoid. Now, in the language of groupoids, so if I call the groupoid G, I'll use G0 to mean the space of identities of the groupoid. This is an O for object. This is notation I learned from Charles Eversham, so I'm too old to change my ways now. So over here, so you have the group of units, that would be the topological full group. In the groupoid language, you'll be looking at those subsets of the groupoid which enjoyed some nice properties. And you've seen this. This is what I would call a local bisection, which I think now you would tend to call a bisection. And of course, it's compact open. So notice I've got an equals there rather than just a subset. So it's things at the top. So it's compact open bisection. I'm going to call this a bisection. But what I mean specifically is you've got a quality there. And these form a group, and that's isomorphic to the group of units of the Boolean inverse monoid. So I would call that topological full group. Now, if you go back to Maturi's talk, his group, so what he's working with, is a homomorphic image of this one by a normal subgroup, and I know what the normal subgroup is. So I think he would, and you guys would tend to look at that because you haven't got an obvious normal subgroup. You're one step closer to being simple. Whereas in my case, I've got a very identifiable normal subgroup. So I'm going to talk about topological full groups in this more generous sense, but you can get back to what Maturi was talking about by taking a quotient by a normal subgroup, but I can tell you what the normal subgroup is. And so that's what I mean by topological full group. So that's my first point. That's what the topological full groups are. The second thing I want to say is I got interested in this through Johannes Kellendorf. He was very nasally directed. He would say that something smelt right. This must be a German idiom. Something smelt right. I've never done maths with my nose before, but he said, no, that smells right. So I would go along with what he said. So he constructed a C-struct algebra from a tiling, specifically a Penrose tiling, a-periodic tiling. And this is what got me interested in all this stuff. But there was one other thing that got me interested, and Britta mentioned it, and I was kind of pleased to hear Britta mention it, which is I moved up from Wales to Scotland in 2004, and I fell amongst group theorists. And you know what those people are like. So I thought I better show there's a connection with what they're doing. I better get a group out of my English semigroups. So I did some work, this is relevant to this talk, where I showed how to construct Thomson's group V, that's other Thomson type groups, from finite strings from a free monoid. Now, you guys would see this as the topological full group of the ATL groupoid associated with the full shift on two letters. That's how you would see it, okay? But the correct way is to start with strings and build up. In fact, I was reading Berger's paper on the Thomson groups, and he went off into secondary algebras, and I just asked a very sort of basic question: could I do everything in terms of inverse semigroups? And this kind of led me to fall amongst you people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Thomson's groups. Now, people have forgotten why he was studying these groups. Now, of course, there are some group theory reasons, but where did they come from originally? Well, they originally came from something called lambda calculus. Now, if you have friends who work in computer science, you will know that they're mad keen on lambda calculus. They can't explain why it's called lambda calculus, by the way, but anyway, they're mad keen on lambda calculus. I've tried to learn lambda calculus and failed many times. It's a sort of abstract model of functional composition, of functional application. Okay, so it's got obvious applications to science and programming. But now this is why I'm going to use the C word, K theory. Yeah, I know who is giving talks on K theory. So if you want to do things correctly, as opposed to, I think I'm safe here, doing things the computer science way, what you would do is convert this into something called a Cartesian closed category. Now, if you're like me, that says nothing. And what it means, roughly, there is a formal definition which is opaque, but the definition that's not opaque is these are categories in which if you have a function of two variables, you can convert these into functions of one variable. That's all that's going on, okay? And you write down the rules in order for that to work, and you make sure that you do so categorical language, and then you reinvent Cartesian closed categories, okay? And you're going to hear this when I talk about these examples. So what I want you to remember for the time being is that Thomson constructed his groups from lambda calculus, but lambda calculi in a categorical language can be thought of as Cartesian closed categories. Okay? So that's the kind of background. Now, what I'm going to do, remember lunch is soon, so you don't have to worry. What I'm going to do is construct two categories. Sorry, two categories. Two categories, right? But two of them. And the first one, you will probably recognize. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a universal algebra. So when I use the word algebra, it's in the sense of universal composite. It's not in the sense of algebra in any kind of final sense. So this is a binary operation. And you've got two unary operations. And you've got a couple of laws that these are supposed to satisfy. And I'm going to write Lawson. You see, as soon as I write law, I want to write Lawson. So the first law, and I should warn you, for some reason, I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm going to write my operations on the right-hand side, except when I don't. So you've got something like the first one. So that law has to hold. And the second one is, well, there are two of them, but, it's something like A, B, Maybe you don't need the alpha there. No, you don't need the alpha there. But I won't put the alpha in there. So lambda gives you a single thing. And then I apply one of my unary operations. This is a binary operation. I've made it very clearly. I'm going to write it much more clearly. There we go. So two inputs, one output. Then I've got a unary operation. And it's either A if I equals 1 and B if I equals 2. So it just picks out the coordinates. Okay, and anything that satisfies, as these operations that satisfies these laws, is called a binary Cantor algebra. Okay, so that forms a category, all the things that satisfy those laws and have those properties. Okay, and that's going to be my category C2. Could be any set. Any set that has this binary operation and two unary operations that satisfies those two laws is a binary Cantor algebra. For example, I could take semigroup. I mean, I'll give you other examples of these things. A semigroup has a single binary operation which is associative. That's a law. So you could look at the category of all semigroups to all things that satisfy this law, or you could look at all the categories of commutative semigroups that satisfy two laws. This is called a variety. I gave a talk many years ago in Glasgow, and it had the word variety in the title, and you've never seen such a bunch of disillusioned and upset algebraic geometers in your life. Or all I can say, you couldn't have a nicer bunch of these. Now, that forms of yes.
I'm just trying to get some. Does it
Yeah.
have to do with the self-similarity of the Cantor set?
See, this is the ideal student. Who's game? I'll come over here in a second, and then I'll answer your question. But you're absolutely right. But this is a purely algebraic structure. There's no topology in here, and because it's a variety, it has three algebras. So it has a free algebra on one generator. Okay, it doesn't matter, I don't know what you do know what it looks like, but you don't know, you know. And then you can take the automorphisms of that guy, gives you a group, and by the miracle of modern science, that's V. So V occurs as the automorphism group of a free structure in this variety. Okay, that's where V comes from. Now, I will come to Jack's point. I won't have time to give all the details, so forgive me. So, what you can look at is a category of all sets which are isomorphic to direct products of themselves. And Cantor set would be an example, but there are other examples as well. Okay. Now, these are very different looking categories. But in fact, they're isomorphic. And I won't have time to tell you why, so you'll have to ask me, because I take my word for it, as I say to my students sometimes. So these are isomorphic. Okay? Now, I think this was known, well, it was certainly known to Higman. It was right at the beginning of the theory of these Thomson groups, but it might have been known earlier. But just so you know, because I can see some of you are getting antsy, if you take the inverse of that, you've got a binary relation, and the two projections then give you your unary operations. So you don't have to do very deep plug. So you've got two categories. So this one is a variety. So what's this one? Now, this is what I'm going to be rude about category theorists. So forgive me, but I feel I'm amongst friends. I've been trying to read a book on topos theory, because this is a topos. This is known, so this category, and you, like that French bloke who discovered he'd been speaking prose all his life, you guys have really been doing topos theory all largely without knowing it. So this is called Johnson, Tarski, topos. Now, what I say has got nothing to do with foundations. So don't read any of that stuff in topos theory books. It's very interesting, but it's not relevant to this talk. It's the first bit. The second thing you have to realize is they got all their terminology from topology, which is entirely misleading because it's really, I mean, there is topology here. I mean, as Jack said, there is a Cantor set here, but it's kind of hidden. So they talk about pre-sheaves. What they really mean are actions, usually by categories, in this case by monoids. They talk about sheaves. What they really mean are actions that satisfy certain properties. You can kind of decode it. You can set up a dictionary and you can take all their. They talk about sieves. You know what a sieve is? It's a right ideal. I wouldn't in a month of Sundays have thought of calling right ideal sieves. So they take perfectly normal words in your favourite language and they convert them into something unintelligible. They talk about Grothendieck topologies. Nothing. I mean, yes, ultimately there is a topology. You can motivate it, but I mean, there's a Grothendieck topology here. You guys have been working with Grothendieck topologies, and you don't necessarily know it. Some of you do, but you know, some of you don't. Anyway, so you've got this category, which is nice to look at this one. Now, this thing is Cartesian closed. Now, I will say it because I haven't got time to write it down, and I crave your indulgence. I'm getting very, very close to the end. I can see you getting antsy. Just think of your lunch. Now, what they do, like us, they have a bag of tricks. So they won't prove this is Cartesian closed directly, right? What they'll start with is the category of actions of the free monoid on two generators. And then this category sits inside it as a category of sheaves. And how do those sheaves arise? They arise from a right ideal. And what is the right ideal? It's the free monoid on two generators without the identity. Or it looks a bit like Kuntz-Krieger relations for the Kuntz-Seister algebra. You just got two of them, haven't you? And you add them together, you get one. It's the same thing, it's just translated into different language. So this is a Cartesian closed category, which is simultaneously a variety. And it gives rise to a group that's a topological four group. Now I will state my two theorems and a question and I will finish. I promise I will finish. Right. So theorem number one is, this is typical. This always happens. Sorry? Can you use the other Oh yeah, there's one underneath. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. The miracles of modern science. There we go. So this is typical. Now, you'll find this in some recent papers by Richard Garner. Now, I have adapted this slightly. Now, I've not said that to sort of march on his, you know, what he's done. But if I've got it wrong, you can blame me and not him. Okay, but the papers are extensive. So this is typical. So the first theorem is every topological four group arises from a Cartesian closed variety. So this is typical. The second theorem, and you want me to tell you this, so I'm going to tell you, because it's about topos theory. You're going to love this. You didn't see this cut. I didn't see it coming. So theorem two is, and you're all asking the question, when do I get the topos? Lawson, tell me, when do I get a topos? I'm going to tell you. When the group, the topological four group, and you're really going to like this, comes from a minimal topological groupoid. That's kind of amazing. Who would have thought there was any connection? So, apologies for being a bit informal. We're going to topos in the case of a minimal. So you've almost got a dictionary. I mean, this is typical mathematician. Oh yeah, that's great what you did, Mr. Wiles, but how about the Riemann hypothesis? So what you really want is a dictionary between a Cadbury point on the one hand and this fancy Cadbury language on the other hand. But you get a topos in the case of a minimal group point, which I find quite amazing. There's any kind of connection, but then you begin to look at it and you think, yeah, I can kind of see where these coverage. So they talk about coverages, and you will talk about Kunz-Krieger relations. I think there's a translation between those two terms. Let me finish off with a question, then you can go for your lunch. So the question is, now, Garner does not dirty himself with any of this stuff. He works purely up there in the realms of topos theory and so forth, okay? Which I don't understand. So here's the question. And I know I'm asking the right audience there. So you've got the Kunz-Krieger algebras, and they're associated with certain kinds of groupoids. So they have topological for groups. What is the analog of the binary Cantor algebra for those groups? Of which I don't know, and he doesn't say. He tells me a lot about toposes, but unfortunately that doesn't help. So analog of binary Cantor algebras for groups from, and I will just say for the time being, finite directed graphs. So you can get Kunz-Krieger algebras. Up here, we had the free monodon tube generators. Over here, you look at the free category on the directed graph. And the graph deep topology would be the same sort of thing, but those would then give you the Kunz-Krieger relations back again. I think, I haven't written down all the details, but that's what I think is really going on. So what I want to know, to finish off, is there is a group associated with a finite directed graph. How is that group described as a group of units of something which is from a universal algebra? So some sort of generalization of the binary Cantor algebra. I've never seen it written down, and that's what I'd like to know in the first instance. I have a whole bunch of other questions. And just for Lisa's benefit, yep, a whole bunch of other semi-groups come into play, possibly different ones, in his work, which are very interesting, but I won't keep any longer.
Quick question?
Are there classification programs in some of those other communities?
No, and in fact, that is actually very interesting. I haven't seen anything analogous because they tend to be up there doing all their fancy ant stuff. So you guys have been, you started with Kunz algebras, then Kunz-Krieger, and then hierarchical graphs, stuff that Jack was doing. And I think they're all giving examples, I think, of Cartesian closed categories. So Cartesian closed varieties. How far have you got? I don't know. It's like all maths. You go 2 steps forward, and then there's 1 step back because you realize that a whole bunch of new questions have just opened up. So I think this is really interesting stuff. But I have to give credit where it's due to Richard Garner. I think these are fantastic pieces of work.